If you or a loved one is living with cancer, you probably have two focal points: how to rid yourself of it and how to prevent it from coming back. You'll get some terrific information today on Cancer Concepts and Complements with Dr. James Belanger. We'll explore natural medicines which may enhance conventional therapies, share cutting-edge research, and offer insight on how diet and natural medicines can play an important role in treating and preventing cancer. The information presented herein is in no way intended as a substitute for medical counseling. Now, here is Dr. James Belanger.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Cancer Concepts and Complements. I'm your host, Dr. James Belanger from the Lexington Natural Health Center in Massachusetts. Today's topic is glioblastoma multiforme. It is the most common, most aggressive type of cancerous primary brain tumors in people today. It affects not too many people. It's certainly not a common cancer like lung cancer or breast cancer. It affects 2 to 3 people per 100,000 in Europe and North America. But the conventional treatment alone is not good enough, so today's show is talking about various natural medicines that look very promising in improving the prognosis of people with glioblastoma multiforme. And other types of brain tumors, certainly a lot of the stuff that I'm going to talk about today can be applied. But today's topic will be just on that particular cancer. So some of the statistics and the studies will be related to that. But the standard therapy for glioblastoma is surgery. They take out as much of the cancer as they can, but this type of cancer tends to spread a lot. It doesn't tend to be just in a particular mass, so it's very difficult to completely surgically remove because of its spreading out. So after surgery, there's radiation to the whole brain radiation, 5 days a week for 6 weeks. And they also do that along with this chemotherapy drug called temozolomide. So patients will take daily temozolomide for 6 weeks along with the radiation therapy for 6 weeks. And after the radiation therapy is done, then they'll do about 5 or 6 cycles of temozolomide, 5 days on every 28 days. But even that particular regimen, which has been studied and is a common regimen used today, median survival is 14.6 months. Now, that's just chemotherapy, radiation, and surgery alone. That's certainly not combined with natural medicines. And there's plenty of people out there that have done way better than that have used a combination approach. And that's what I'm going to advocate today and talk to you about the research that has been done. But yeah, median survival is 14.6 months with the chemo, whole brain radiation, and the temozolomide. 2-year survival rate is 26.5%, 2-year survival doing that combination. And the chemo does add a few extra months there along with the radiation, but the radiation is the primary therapy. All right, so what are some natural things that can be done? First, the thing that I like to focus on is doing things to make chemo and radiation work better. Why whole brain radiation, even after surgery, and the chemotherapy is the median survival only 14 months? That's because there can be pockets or areas of low levels of oxygen in the cancer. And radiation destroys cancer cells by mixing with oxygen and forming free radicals. You keep hearing things that, free radicals are bad, but free radicals are good when you're trying to fight cancer with radiation. Radiation mixes with oxygen and forms these things called oxidants or free radicals, as we know, and the free radicals damage the DNA of the cancer and lead to programmed cell death. However, there will be areas within the cancer of low levels of oxygen. They call it tumor hypoxia. And if there's not enough oxygen flowing to these particular areas where the cancer may be, then the radiation cannot create those free radicals to destroy the cancer. In fact, they've found that these hypoxic cells, these areas of the brain tumors that are not getting enough oxygen, you'll need 3 times higher doses of radiation than in areas that are getting plenty of oxygen. So I want to talk about natural things that improve oxygen flow. But first, why are they so radiation resistant? Well, cancer cells that are hypoxic are they're in this different state in their cell cycle that makes them more resistant to radiation, along with not being able to generate the free radicals. And that there's this chemical called HIF that gets upregulated that stimulates blood vessel growth in these areas, that stimulates proliferation of cells, that even allows the cells to start to use the glucose more. The brain uses primarily glucose. It can use something called ketones, which are fatty acid breakdown products, but its primary fuel is glucose. And the cancer cells will even upregulate their glucose levels so they can live without the oxygen and use glucose as a fuel and turn it into lactic acid and do this type of cellular metabolism. Okay, so how do you know if there's areas of hypoxia in the cancer? There's some simple blood tests that can predict if there is hypoxia, and you want to make sure that these blood tests are normalized, especially during the radiation and afterwards too. So one of the blood tests is called fibrinogen. Fibrinogen is a protein that our liver makes, but it can be made by white blood cells that are surrounding the brain tumors. The white cells are called M2 macrophages. So they're types of white cells that act like a supportive structure around the cancer, but they can release this stuff called fibrinogen. Well, when fibrinogen is in excess in the blood, especially in the blood vessels around the cancer, it causes the red blood cells in the blood vessels to get trapped and to like clump. They call it rouleau, where the blood vessels kind of stack up like a stack of coins. And that leads to impaired circulation, which leads to a lack of oxygen. So you'd never want high levels of fibrinogen. That's a simple blood test that can be done at any lab, and it really should be between 180 and 310. And if it's not, there are natural things that I'll get into in a minute that can lower it. You need some fibrinogen because it's needed to clot the blood, but if it's too high, the blood won't flow properly to these areas of cancer, and you'll get lack of oxygen, and that leads to impaired radiation response. There's another simple test. It's called the ESR. ESR is an old lab test. They take the blood and they stick it in a tube, and they see how quickly the blood settles, how quickly it falls down this tube. And it's not supposed to fall that much within an hour's period. If it does, that means that the red cells are getting weighted down by something, in this case, fibrinogen. Fibrinogen binds to these red cells, kind of weights them down and allows them to clump more and fall in this tube in the lab test. So it's called the SED rate, or the ESR. And there's research done, in just brand new research, anti-cancer research in 2014 in Slovenia, saying that they just measured that in 94 patients with glioblastoma prior to surgery, and those that had levels that were elevated to this ESR had a worse survival. So it's something that is tied in with the fibrinogen, and if ESR is high, fibrinogen's often high, and you getting that down might make radiation and chemotherapy work better. Before I get into things, though, there's some other blood tests that can be done to also predict this. Thrombin. Thrombin is another protein. It's in our blood, circulating in our blood, and it converts this fibrinogen stuff into something called fibrin. And fibrin can surround the cancer, kind of like a wall. You can think about it as a castle around the cancer that might protect it from the immune system and also interfere with good blood flow and good levels of the chemotherapy getting in. But it also creates what's called interstitial pressure. It puts pressure on nearby blood vessels, causing them to collapse. And they find that like 4 to 10% of all blood vessels of tumors have these transient stoppages where they close off at any time due to pressure. And they collapse easily because of this fibrin that's around them, collapsing them. And the blood vessels of tumors are not the same as regular blood vessels. They're not lined with smooth muscle cells, and they just easily collapse. And that leads to lack of oxygen too, this collapsing. Besides the inside the blood being more clumpy from this fibrinogen, outside of the blood vessel, all this fibrin, they call it the stroma, developing, which causes collapsing. But the cancer's getting the glucose that it needs and using that to help to grow, and then that lack of oxygen makes it more aggressive. Proliferation pathways are upregulated. So thrombin is something that you want to get to a normal level as well. There is this drug called argatroban that has been shown to prolong the survival in mice with gliomas, glioblastoma, and it inhibits thrombin. So there are some other natural things that can help this, and I'll get to in a second. The last test is measuring Ddimer. Ddimer is a fibrin breakdown product, and there has been a study in this Austrian journal in 2011 showing that patients with glioblastoma, if they had an elevated D-dimer, it's associated with a worse prognosis. So the point of this is to do some measurements and making sure fibrinogen's normal, ESR is normal, thrombin, antithrombin complex it's called, is normal, and D-dimer levels are normal at all times. If they're not, or if they start to progress during radiation, during chemo, or even during the maintenance phase, that you want to make sure that they are declining, because that's going to lead to low levels of oxygen, and the cancer starts to become more aggressive when it's not getting the oxygen that normal levels of oxygen will start to induce blood vessel growth and start to spread out more. Okay, so what are some natural things that affect this? Well, ginkgo is one thing. We all have heard that ginkgo helps improve blood flow to the brain. That's why it's been studied for Alzheimer's, dementia, and various conditions related to the brain. It improves blood flow all over the body. And there's been some research done, not in glioblastoma, but another type of cancer, fibrosarcoma, showing that ginkgo makes radiation work better by reducing the clumping of these red blood cells, improving blood flow to an area where the cancer is, and helping that. So it hasn't been studied with radiation with glioblastoma, but it looks like a very good candidate. But it has been studied on its own. Ginkgo has a direct inhibitory effect on glioblastoma, and part of it might be because of its effects on blood flow. But so there was a study done in Anti-Cancer Research 2006 where they gave a group, it was an animal study where they gave a group of animals with glioblastoma either just a control, a saline control, or different dosings of ginkgo. And they did this for 1 week is all, just 1 week. And then they looked at tumor mass after the end of it. Sorry, it was after 55 days. 55 days they carried it out. Tumor mass was 2/3 the size in the high-dose ginkgo group versus the control. 2/3 the size. Not a huge effect, but some effect. And then you couple that with radiation and maybe chemotherapy, and it might have even a better effect. But it does affect something called benzodiazepine receptors, which tend to be over amplified in glioblastoma, which leads to increased proliferation. So it has a few effects, a direct effect, and it might make radiation work better. So you can measure fibrinogen. If fibrinogen is elevated, ginkgo might be a useful thing to help normalize the fibrinogen and help improve blood flow and make radiation work better. Garlic has been also studied. This one's just a test tube study, but garlic I use all the time. I find it very good at lowering thrombin. And like I said, if you have excess levels of thrombin in the blood, which can be tested, it's associated with a worse prognosis with glioblastoma. It leads to the generation of that stroma, which surrounds the cancer and protects it from chemotherapy and leads to those transient stoppages in blood flow, which impairs radiation. But garlic has something in it called allicin, which they have mixed with glioblastoma cells in a laboratory, published in Oncology Reports 2012 in Korea, showing that the higher the dose of this allicin, the more cell death of glioblastoma. So that's an easy thing. Eat more garlic. Lumbrokinase is another natural compound found in earthworms, actually. Earthworms make this enzyme called lumbrokinase, which has been studied in Chinese medicine and given for what they call blood stagnation, thicker blood. But lumbrokinase is very good at normalizing fibrinogen. It might be another useful thing with glioblastoma. Certainly, combining these with aspirin and other blood thinners needs to be carefully monitored because you don't want to thin the blood too much. But if there's excess levels of fibrinogen or thrombin, that indicates that the blood is thicker than normal, and we just want to normalize blood clotting, not thin it too much. There's another blood test that can be done that indicates that the cancer is not getting enough oxygen and is going to be more resistant to radiation and chemotherapy, and it's called Osteopontin. Osteopontin is a blood test that can be measured, and those patients that have high levels of that are more likely to be resistant to radiation. There's a study done in Radiation Therapy Oncology 2013. Patients that had over 167 micrograms per liter of osteopontin were more likely to have radioresistance, and it's associated with a more poorer survival. And it's a common thing that can be elevated. 90% of patients with glioblastoma have elevated levels of this osteopontin. And so there's another study done where they looked at survival rate. Those that had high levels of osteopontin, the median survival was 9 months versus those that had normal levels or low levels was 22 months. And so osteopontin indicates lack of oxygen, and it will stimulate more of that thrombin to be released, which leads to that stroma, that thing that protects the cancer, leads to increased blood flow, and it leads to what's called stem cell-like properties, allows the cancer cells to replicate more aggressively and promote replication. So we want to do things that lower osteopontin. And there's been numerous natural medicines that has been shown to lower osteopontin. One of them is a plant called Chinese gold thread, or Coptis chinensis. Coptis chinensis, or Chinese gold thread, contains a compound called berberine. Berberine is an alkaloid found in there, and it has been shown to inhibit osteopontin. So if that's high, that is one useful thing. It's been studied also in animals to inhibit glioblastoma. Andrographis is a herb from India that has been shown to decrease osteopontin as well. And it's a simple herb that can be used, and osteopontin, if it's elevated and if it declines with andrographis, then that indicates better blood flow and more improvements in radiation responses and chemotherapy responses. Green tea has also been studied to lower osteopontin, and there's been several studies done on green tea in glioblastoma. There was one study done. This one was just in animals, and it was in the Journal of Neuro-Oncology 2006 in Montreal, showing that green tea made radiation work better. That radiation can destroy or damage the blood vessel walls feeding the cancer, the blood vessel cells. And they found that radiation alone reduced the levels of these endothelial cells, they call the blood vessel walls, by 30%. But when it was combined with green tea, it reduced it by 70%. So green tea inhibited the blood vessels feeding the cancer and takes away some of their fuel sources. So it makes radiation work better. And then on top of it, there's been a study showing that it makes the temozolomide drug work better. So it looks like a really good candidate to be studied for glioblastoma, where there is radiation given concurrently with temozolomide. But there was a study done at UCLA, Cancer Letters 2011, where they gave this compound found in green tea called EGCG along with this drug temozolomide. And they started this 7 days before temozolomide. And then they gave this EGCG alone, or EGCG with temozolomide, or temozolomide alone. Well, the green tea compound EGCG didn't have any effect on its own. Temozolomide certainly did, and animals survived for between 41 and 87 days, depending upon the type of glioblastoma they got. But when they combined the temozolomide with the EGCG, they survived longer. And so instead of the lower level of 41 days, it went up to 55 days. And instead of the high level of 87 days, they survived up to 140. So the range was 55 to 140 days with the green tea plus the temozolomide versus 41 to 87 days with temozolomide alone. And how did it work? Well, one of the things, it lowers osteopontin. It also affects this thing called GRP78, which is a compound that inhibits cell death. So when a cancer is exposed to radiation and temozolomide, it upregulates this GRP78, which prevents the cancer from dying. It allows it to adapt, shall we say, to the chemo and radiation to survive the insult and continue growing. Well, the EGCG helps stop that, and that's one mechanism how it works. It also allows the chemotherapy to stay inside the cancer cells longer. So it looks like a really good candidate, combining it with chemo and radiation. Okay, I'm going to take a break, and when I get back, I'm going to talk about more mechanisms of resistance to chemo and radiation. This is Cancer Concepts and Complements.
This is Cancer Concepts and Complements with Dr. James Belanger. The information presented herein is in no way intended as a substitute for medical counseling. If you would like to find out more about the Lexington Natural Health Center, please visit lexingtonnaturalhealth.com. That's LexingtonNaturalHealth.com. Now, back to this week's program.
Hello, welcome back to Cancer Concepts and Compliments. I'm your host, Dr. James Belanger from the Lexington Natural Health Center. Okay, let's continue our discussion about natural medicines that may work to enhance the effectiveness of chemotherapy and radiation in glioblastoma. Okay, another topic is when cancer cells or glioblastoma cells are exposed to radiation and the temozolomide, one way that they'll protect themselves from these insults is to manufacture something called glutathione. Glutathione is an antioxidant that is made in our body. It's made from three simple what's called amino acids, and every cell makes it. But as the glioblastoma cells are being exposed to radiation or temozolomide, they will make a lot of this glutathione to protect themselves, because glutathione inhibits free radicals. And I mentioned that radiation works by generating free radicals. So it takes the oxygen that's in the blood supplying the glioblastoma cells and turns them into free radicals. And those free radicals are the things, or the oxidants they're called, that damage the cancer cells. Temozolomide, the chemotherapy drug, also works by generating free radicals. And so this is a natural mechanism of resistance, is the cancer cells start to upregulate enzymes and levels of glutathione that help protect them. And there's been research showing that that is the case, and that inhibiting glutathione actually helps potentiate temozolomide and radiation. So what are some natural things that might affect the glutathione pathway? Well, selenium has been studied. Selenium, not in glioblastoma in particular, but they did a really interesting study in lung cancer in animals where they gave them chemotherapy plus selenium or just chemotherapy alone. And they noticed after one dose of chemotherapy, the cancer shrunk in both groups equally. But after the second dose, the cancer was starting to become more resistant, and the chemo wasn't working as well in the group given chemo alone. But when they were given the selenium with it, that it allowed the cancer to continue to shrink. And when they took the cancer out, the cancer was not able to generate glutathione levels like it was in the group not given selenium. So the selenium actually decreased levels of glutathione in the cancer, preventing that second dose from becoming resistant and allowing it to continue to work. And it also increased the levels of glutathione in healthy cells. But there has been a study done in Japan in 1996 in the Biology Trace Element Research Journal, where they gave rats glioblastoma and different dosages of selenium, and found that selenium helped improve survival in the groups compared to the control. The survival was significantly longer. It was in Japanese, so I wasn't able to read the full study, but interesting that it might be because of its effects on glutathione. Combining it with radiation might be another useful study, too, because of that other research that's been done on selenium. Ashwagandha looks like another useful natural compound to make radiation work better, and temozolomide. Ashwagandha is an Indian herb. It's also called Withania somnifera. It's used a lot for anxiety, sleep issues, but it does get into the brain because it does have this effects on anxiety, and it's been shown to lower tumor levels of glutathione. And by lowering the levels of glutathione, the cancer is exposed to more of these free radicals, which helps destroy them. It also has been shown to make temozolomide work better by depleting this enzyme called MGMT. There's this enzyme that becomes upregulated in glioblastoma cells that allows them to repair themselves after being damaged by temozolomide. It's called MGMT. Well, the animals that were exposed to a compound found in ashwagandha called withania or withanorin were more sensitive to temozolomide because it actually depleted or decreased the activity of this repair enzyme. Also, some research been done showing that when animals were exposed to ashwagandha, the glioblastoma cells turned into less aggressive types of brain tumor cells. There's different types of brain tumors, malignant brain tumors, but the glioblastoma is the most aggressive kind. And then there's one before it called the anaplastic astrocytoma, which is not as aggressive, grows slower. And the ashwagandha was able to turn the glioblastoma cells into a less of aggressive type of brain tumor. So that's really interesting. They call that a differentiation effect, differentiating or turning a more aggressive cell type into a less aggressive type. And this was just done on an alcoholic extract of ashwagandha leaves. When they tested the individual components, they were all had similar effects. So there's lots of things in ashwagandha besides wethanoferin. There's other things, and the whole extract had a useful effect. There is a test that can be done to see if ashwagandha will be useful. It's called the Neurocell adhesion molecule. There's a research showing in the Journal of Neuro-Oncology 2007 you can measure neurocell adhesion molecules actually in the blood, and if they're high, the patients have a worse prognosis, and that's something that ashwagandha has been shown to affect, and that's a way of telling that it's working. I always find lab tests are very useful in helping to predict the course of therapy, to help choose things. Like I mentioned, fibrinogen levels elevated, well, ginkgo might be a useful thing. If thrombin is elevated, garlic may be useful, and you want to make sure that those stay normal. Osteopontin, you don't want that to be elevated. If it's elevated, well, there's the green tea, andrographis. There's different things that help with that. Well, neurocell adhesion molecules, if those are elevated, ashwagandha can be a useful thing, and you can make sure that that is normalizing as a way of tracking that. Another interesting thing that affects this glutathione. Glutathione is that compound that, again, protects the cancer cells against those free radicals generated by temozolomide and radiation. Well, cancer cells can release something called glutamate, and glutamate will get turned into glutathione. Glutathione is made from something called glutamate, cysteine, and glycine, 3 amino acids, and they turn into glutathione. Well, they found that glioblastoma cells will actually release this glutamate, and that leads to production of glutathione. But the glutamate also leads to death of surrounding neurons. So these brain tumor cells are surrounded by healthy cells, and in order for the glioblastoma to spread throughout the brain, it actually has to destroy whatever's in its path, and so it will release this substance called glutamate to do that. And glutamate also can lead to seizures, and that's one reason why some people with glioblastoma present with seizures. Well, there's a very interesting natural compound that inhibits the release of glutamate. It's an antagonist to glutamate and lowers glutathione. It has been studied in other types of tumors where they give this theanine, it's called, from green tea. It's from green tea. It's a different compound in green tea than EGCG, which I mentioned earlier. But they've given animals theanine and measured amounts of glutathione in tumors, and it lowers the glutathione levels in tumors, but actually enhances the glutathione levels in healthy cells to protect them against, radiation and the temozolomide, but makes the tumor cells more susceptible. So we know theanine crosses the blood-brain barrier. It's been studied for anxiety, ADHD, and it has an anti-anxiety effect by decreasing glutamate. So it's also been studied in seizures in animals. So instead of using Keppra or some other drug to treat seizures, theanine would be a useful thing to study because it inhibits glutamate release to stop a lot of the seizures. It lowers the glutathione in the cancer cells to help allow radiation and chemo to work better. And it helps prevent the spread of the cancer, or may help prevent the spread by affecting glutamate, which is needed for that. So theanine might be a very useful compound as well. Other natural medicines that can enhance the effects of chemoradiation in glioblastoma is resveratrol. Resveratrol is a compound found in red grapes. It's found in wine, it's found in chocolate, and it has been studied to affect many pathways that are found in glioblastoma. But it might help reduce levels of the cancer stem cells. Cancer stem cells are the ones that are the resistant ones that to the radiation, the chemotherapy. Those are the ones that contribute to proliferation and spreading of the cancer. And there's been research showing that resveratrol induces cell death of these cancer stem cell-like cells. It's been studied with radiation, where they gave, and this was done in the Journal of Cellular Physiology in 2012 in Taiwan, where they gave animals glioblastoma, injected it right into their brains. They gave radiation or alone or radiation with the resveratrol, and after 5 weeks, none of the animals were alive in the radiation group. And after 10 weeks, 50% were still alive in the radiation with the resveratrol group. So none survived in 5 weeks. After 5 weeks, radiation alone. over half survived even 10 weeks later with resveratrol and radiation. And resveratrol works making radiation work better by locking cancer cells in what's called the G2M phase. Cancer cells are in different states. So some cells may be in a resting phase. Some are replicating their DNA. Some are in growth pathways. They're growing things that are needed to divide in half. And some are in the process of almost dividing in half. Well, they found that if the cancer cells are right on the border of just getting ready to divide in half, they're the most susceptible to radiation therapy. And if you can lock them in that area, so preventing them from being in any other part of the cell cycle, then radiation can work better, and that's what resveratrol has been shown to do. I always give people an analogy is, say they're, in the bedroom sleeping, and then they wake up and they go into the bathroom, and then they go into the kitchen and the living room. What happens if, forgive the analogy, somebody threw a smoke bomb or something into the bathroom? Well, if they're not in the bathroom, they're going to escape that particular smoke bomb. If the cancer cells are not in the G2M phase, they're not as susceptible to radiation. If they're in a different room or state, resveratrol locks them in that room and keeps them from getting out, allowing the radiation to work better that way. There's also this fatty acid that is found in all brain cells, including glioblastoma, but it leads to cell death. When radiation hits the cell membranes of the cancer, there's this ceramide, and this ceramide is something that induces cell death. Well, the cancer cells will deplete their levels of ceramide in their cell membranes as a way of protecting themselves from radiation. Resveratrol has been shown to prevent the loss of this ceramide, so it can be used to induce cell death. So pretty interesting. It does cross the blood-brain barrier too, resveratrol, so it's been studied for all kinds of brain-related conditions too, like Alzheimer's disease. Temozolomide can also be enhanced by resveratrol. That has been studied in another animal study in CNS Neuroscience Therapeutics 2012 in China, where they injected mice, again with glioblastomas, right into the brain. And 8 days later, they started some treatment, either a control group, the temozolomide, the resveratrol alone, or temozolomide plus resveratrol. And then after 28 days, they looked to see how much the cancer had grew. The resveratrol by itself, just like I mentioned with green tea, did not affect the cancer by itself, but when it was combined with the chemotherapy, it did. That the amount of dividing cancer cells went from 80% in the control group to 30% in the temozolomide alone group to 5% in the temozolomide plus resveratrol. So resveratrol plus the temozolomide reduced the amount of cancer cells in the tumors from being able to divide. And then if they don't divide, they can't grow and spread from 30% down to 5%. And resveratrol actually helped the temozolomide generate more free radicals. Temozolomide helps kill cancer cells by generating free radicals, just like radiation. And resveratrol actually increased that amount in the brain in the areas of the cancer. And that leads to inhibition of cell proliferation and leads to cell death. And it was interesting when they gave resveratrol with an antioxidant called N-acetylcysteine, then the resveratrol didn't have any effect. So combining resveratrol with some natural things might interfere with it. N-acetylcysteine is a natural compound that actually the body will turn into glutathione. And if that is given along with radiation or chemotherapy, it could be used by the cancer cells to make the glutathione, and that cancels out the effects of these oxidants that are generated by radiation and chemotherapy and resveratrol. So certain antioxidants shouldn't be used. Resveratrol, it's interesting. You might read it. It is classified as an antioxidant, but it actually generated more free radicals in the brain of these animals. So it's more of a pro-oxidant, they call it. Another compound that has been studied with this is vitamin K3 with vitamin C. We hear about vitamin C as being an antioxidant, and it is, but when it's combined with another vitamin, vitamin K3 or menadione, it's actually been shown to deplete cancer cells of this glutathione, increase those free radicals at the site of the cancer, and it's been shown to make radiation work better. And this vitamin K3 and menadione or vitamin C combined with it has been shown to have a direct inhibitory effect on glioblastoma. So another promising looking substance. It's been studied in men with prostate cancer, showing that it can slow prostate cancer. So it's a well-tolerated natural substance, studied in people with prostate cancer, studied in animals with brain tumors. Another natural compound that looks promising to make radiation and temozolomide work better is Genestein from soybean. Genestein has been shown to also, like resveratrol, lock cancer cells in the G2M phase and helping to promote the radiation-induced cell death. We'll talk later, too, that Genestein has an anti-blood vessel effect on tumors. And then good old curcumin, which appears on a lot of all my talks, has all kinds of broad-spectrum anti-cancer effects, has been also shown to enhance the effectiveness of temozolomide and radiation by actually increasing those oxidants at the site of the cancer, but increasing glutathione in healthy cells, protecting them. So very promising things where you get more favored death of the cancer cells, but protecting those healthy cells against all these free radicals from temozolomide and radiation. So, and curcumin also has broad spectrum effects on blood vessels, which we'll get into. Okay, I'm going to take another break. When I get back, now we're going to switch gears and talk about natural compounds that inhibit blood vessel growth in glioblastoma. This is Cancer Concepts and Complements.
This is Cancer Concepts and Complements with Dr. James Belanger. The information presented herein is in no way intended as a substitute for medical counseling. If you would like to find out more about the Lexington Natural Health Center, please visit lexingtonnaturalhealth.com. That's lexingtonnaturalhealth.com. Now, back to this week's program.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Cancer Concepts and Complements. I'm your host, Dr. James Belanger. So now let's talk about natural medicines that inhibit blood vessel growth in glioblastoma. Glioblastoma is highly innervated with blood vessels, lots of blood vessels supplying it, and there's lots of compounds that the glioblastoma cells use to provide the cancer with those blood vessels. One of those compounds, is called FGF, fibroblastic growth factor, and the other one is called VEGF. And then there's numerous other things. Like thrombin, I mentioned earlier, also acts as a blood vessel growth factor. Well, normally I measure those in the blood of people with other types of cancers, but because of the blood-brain barrier, the blood is not the best way to measure this. So it can be measured in the spinal fluid, not the easiest test to obtain, but there is a research study done in Neurosurgery 2004 where patients that had higher levels of those in the spinal fluid had a worse prognosis. So it's something that could be done to make sure that those are not elevated and using natural medicines to normalize them. But I don't do that on a routine basis, but it could be done to help assess it. What would be also useful in checking spinal fluid for is, the cancer cells will end up in the spinal fluid, and you can send the spinal fluid to a lab in Greece called RGCC, where they will test the cancer against all kinds of natural compounds, even chemotherapy drugs, even though it's usually pretty much just temozolomide used, but they will test of all kinds of natural compounds against the glioblastoma cells to see which ones can directly kill them, and then they can also measure things that inhibit blood vessel growth and stuff as well in these glioblastoma cells. So spinal fluid is a useful medium for measuring some of these things. But FGF, I usually use Boswellia if it was high, but like I said, if I don't obtain a spinal fluid, Boswellia is a useful herb that has been studied. I'm going to get into Boswellia in a minute. Curcumin also has effects on FGFs, and like I mentioned, that makes radiation and temozolomide work better, so that's useful. But there is a blood test that can be done to assess somewhat the blood vessels, and it's a blood test. It's called MMP9. MMP9 is an enzyme released by glioblastoma cells that allow them to break down healthy brain tissue and spread out and allow blood vessels to access tumors. And there's research in Clinical Cancer Research 2006 that if MMP9 was elevated, patients had more active tumors. So curcumin is very good at lowering MMP9. It actually has been studied in Quebec in brain tumors, glioblastoma in animals. Molecular Nutrition, Food and Research 2010, giving curcumin inhibits blood vessel growth in brain tumors in animals, and its mechanism of action was decreasing this MMP9. So it can be measured in the blood, useful marker to see how curcumin is working. Curcumin, one of those, if you've been listening to some other shows, you have to have a lot of curcumin in order for it to work. 8 to 12 grams is what most of the research shows. But it does cross the blood-brain barrier. It's actually been studied for Alzheimer's disease, dementia, certainly stroke prevention, things like that. Has an anti-inflammatory effect in the brain. So it does get into the brain, but you have to use a pretty high dose. And those are the kind of doses that I will use to decrease elevated MMP9. Another herb that has been shown to inhibit blood vessels in animal models is Angelica sinensis. It's also called dong quai. It's a Chinese herb, and they'll use often the root of it. And there's been a whole bunch of studies done in glioblastoma. One was in a study called a journal Pathobiology in 2006, where it inhibited the growth of brain tumors by 60% compared to controls in animals models. And its mechanism was to inhibit this compound called VEGF, which is a vascular growth factor, which can be elevated in the spinal fluid if that is tested. Angelica could lower that, and that's a way of tracking Angelica's effects. It also affects something called cathepsin B, which is something that allows the cancer to become more invasive. And glioblastoma has a habit of becoming very invasive. Cathepsin, like cathepsin B, is highly expressed, and in glioblastoma allows it to spread out. Shark cartilage has actually been shown also to affect glioblastoma. Shark cartilage was really popular in the 80s and early 90s because they said the sharks don't get cancer, and cartilage has no blood vessels in it. Cartilage gets its nutrients from the synovial fluid. So some researchers decided, does shark cartilage have compounds in it that inhibit blood vessels? Well, in the journal Microvascular Research 2011, so there seems to be this resurgence now in studying shark cartilage in France, showed that shark cartilage actually degenerated tumor blood vessels in glioblastoma patients, animal patients there. And so they did a study done where they injected rats with glioblastoma, and they used this really aggressive type of glioblastoma, gliosarcoma, and which can even spread to the liver and the lungs. And they used a massive dose of shark cartilage. That's what a lot of the research has shown is really high doses, equivalent of 32 grams in a person, what they gave these animals, but orally. And after the animal's survival time was 20 days without any treatment at all. And they extended their survival by about 30%, the shark cartilage given. Some of the animals were alive at 43 days at the end of the study. They ended the study at day 43. But none of the animals were alive at 20 days if they didn't get any of the shark cartilage. When they took the brain tumors out, they were 1/4 the size of the controls. And its mechanism is inhibiting blood vessels. So another interesting thing to put some more research in there. Boswellia. Boswellia is a herb. It's frankincense. It's an Indian herb that there's even human studies on kids taking Boswellia that have other types of brain tumors, not glioblastoma, showing it inhibits swelling of the brain tumors, which is a useful thing to do, because the common treatment for swelling is Decadron. Decadron is a steroid, and Decadron suppresses the immune system. We need the immune system to fight cancer, so it's not the best thing. Plus, Decadron raises blood sugar in people, and I mentioned that brain tumors like sugar, so that Boswellia would be another very useful thing to do some more research on. And it has been studied in kids, pretty high doses of it to inhibit swelling, but it also has some direct anti-glioblastoma effects. It's been shown to induce cell death. It's been shown to inhibit that FGF blood vessel growth factor test. Well, there was a study done in Journal of Neuro-Oncology in the Netherlands. Now, this was a rat study, but they gave different dosages of Boswellia versus a control, and the survival was twice as long in the Boswellia group, the high-dose Boswellia group, than in the control. And when they took out the tumors, there was a lot of cell death present in those tumors. So Boswellia could be measured in that RGCC grease test to see how it affects the glioblastoma cells found in the spinal fluid if a spinal fluid was sent to the grease lab. There's another really useful compound found in this herb, Gotu Kola. Gotu Kola is this herb that's been studied to help with memory and dementia, that kind of thing. And it has this compound called asiatic acid in it, or asiaticosides. And this was a study done at the University of Colorado in 2014, molecular carcinogenesis, where they gave animals a very high dose of asiatic acid, just orally, and they noticed at the end of their study 54% decrease in tumor volume compared to the control, and it didn't have any toxicity. And it does cross the blood-brain barrier, and they even did MRIs on the animals and found that also decreased the size in the MRI. So it induces cell death pathways, another thing that could be checked the RGCC to see if the cancer is sensitive to asiatic acid, but a spinal fluid has to be obtained. If a spinal fluid is not obtained, it can't hurt to take it. You have to take a pretty high dose. The amount that they use in the animals is often equivalent to, because this product, it's not easy to obtain high doses of asiaticosides, but it is found in this herb, Gotu Kola. Usually it's like 28 or so pills of it, usually, like close to 3 grams of Gotu Kola, and most of the pills have only 100 milligrams in there and 10 milligrams of asiaticosides. But it is very well tolerated and has some direct anti-cancer effects. Something in tomatoes also has been shown. This was a human study where they gave 8 milligrams of lycopene from tomatoes with radiation or just radiation alone. And the group that got the lycopene plus the radiation, time to progression was 40 weeks versus 26 weeks in the radiation alone. So it went from 26 to 40 with 8 milligrams of lycopene. And how does it work? Lycopene inhibits something called insulin growth factor. Insulin growth factor is something that can be overexpressed in glioblastoma, and it leads to inhibition of cell death. So simple thing, tomato paste is the richest source of lycopene. There's this growth factor pathway that can be overexpressed in glioblastoma called EGF. EGF receptors are commonly overexpressed. About 40% of patients with glioblastoma that will be overexpressed compared to other brain tumors types. And it can be actually measured in the blood. EGFR can be measured. Quest Diagnostics is a lab that has that test. And there's a research study in Tumori in 2007 in Italy where they measured that in the blood of 65 patients with brain cancers. 35 of them were glioblastoma, comparing it to healthy individuals, showing that brain tumor patients were more likely to have elevated levels of this serum level of EGFR compared to healthy controls, and then that corresponded with a worse survival if it was elevated. Well, if it comes back elevated, there's a natural compound, melatonin. Melatonin, we know, is made in the brain and helps with sleep, but it has been studied to inhibit the growth of cancers, including glioblastoma. They studied it in Italy, in Oncology Journal in 1996, where they gave 30 patients with glioblastoma radiation therapy alone, or radiation therapy plus 20 milligrams of melatonin daily. Survival at 1 year was 6 out of the 14 patients with the combination had a survival at 1 year versus 1 out of 16 in the radiation alone. Now, this was just radiation alone. This is an old study, 1996. Temozolomide wasn't, I don't think, around at that particular time, but radiation alone, there only 1 out of 16 improved to 6 out of 14 in the melatonin. And what was interesting, it also helps reduce steroid side effects, which can, like I said, raise blood sugar and suppress the immune system. But melatonin looks like a very interesting thing. There's this compound found in the essential oil of peppermint and lavender and celery seeds, that stuff that you smell when you're smelling lavender and peppermint and stuff. There's a compound, it's called Perilla Alcohol. Perilla Alcohol is this compound that they've actually studied in people with glioblastoma, and it doesn't get, it really upsets the stomach when you take it orally. So it's given as an inhalation in the nose, and then it goes right into the brain that way, inhaled into the nose 4 times a day, and they escalate it. And some of the patients, 19% of them were still alive after 4 years of using this. And this was studied in Anti-Cancer Research 2013 in Brazil. So they actually did a phase 2 trial on this. And it's, 4 years, 19%, that's a really good survival rate for glioblastoma. And it was very well tolerated, just a little soreness in the nose. But you can use lidocaine nasal sprays with it to reduce soreness, to kind of numb the inside of the nose, to tolerate the Perilla alcohol. It's quite expensive stuff, but nothing compared to a drug. It can go like $700 for like a concentrated amount of the nasal spray. But a lot of these drugs, if they weren't paid for, are tens of thousands. Running out of time, but there's a few other things. Let's talk about the immune system. The immune system is something that needs to be supported with glioblastoma. It's really common to have imbalances in the immune system. You can check that with a lab in Wisconsin called Neuroscience. There's an imbalance in what's called the type 1 and type 2 immune system that's commonly out of balance. And there's this Chinese formula called Juzhen Tehoto, or they also call it Energy Campo or Minor Blue Perm formula, that has been shown to improve the imbalance in the immune system, to make more of the type 1 and less of the type 2, and that's been studied as well. Okay, I'm going to run out of time here, so we enjoyed the show, got a better idea of natural things that can help support healing in people with glioblastoma. Next week, I'm going to talk about non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, B-cell lymphomas. This is Cancer, Concepts, and Complements.
Thank you for joining us this week. Cancer Concepts and Complements with Dr. James Belanger can be heard live every Tuesday morning at 6 a.m. Pacific Time, 9 a.m. Eastern Time on the Voice America Health and Wellness Channel. We hope to see you next week for another show.